So everybody, thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Redi Tlhabi, and I am a broadcaster. My family always says that as a broadcaster, you get away with a lot because you know a little bit about each topic, but never quite the expert on a particular issue. But I do want to share, based on what today is about, launching the International Review of Philanthropy and Social Investment Journal, that when I was on the radio, people knew that if they picked up the phone and communicated a particular need in a community or at a personal level, in half a second, the lines will go bad as top-end individuals, experts phoned in to come together and offer some help and some relief. What also astounded me when I was on the radio is that it took a minute or two to raise funds every time there was a natural disaster. People were just ready and waiting. And I was just always fascinated about how much money organizations were sitting on, what we could achieve as a society if we were able to find mechanisms to link communities to where the resources are, to create collaborations and partnership, to really be a society that is attuned to the needs of the community without anyone having to kind of pick up the radio and phone on the radio. It told me that there were a lot of resources, but how are we using them? How are we creating opportunities for communities and individuals that are in need, or causes that are important for them to gain visibility? And then it raises all sorts of interesting questions about policy making, about where the power lies. Are communities just recipients, passive recipients of philanthropy and social investment? Can they be given agency? Can their voices be amplified, where they can make the decisions, where they can direct the budgeting, where they can direct the decision making? How do we assess whether we are making successful inroads? How do we assess whether philanthropy and social investment is achieving its intended benefits? And as we celebrate, encourage, embrace philanthropy and social investment, are there some not so great sides of it that we need to be aware of? And if that is the case, how do we theorize all of this? Here's another thing. How often have you sat in front of a decision maker who didn't quite understand what you were trying to say? But that person has the power to direct resources, to direct policy. And if in those philanthropic organizations, in those big corporates that have lots of money, the intentions are good, you could have some unintended consequences when you don't understand the field of philanthropy and social investment. So this journal, my understanding, is that it's a useful tool for policymakers, for researchers, for journalists such as myself, for philanthropists, for communities as well. So I'm very excited to be with you today. Some housekeeping rules. Later on in the program, we are going to open up the Q&A, question and answer session. What I'm going to ask is that you use the chat function of this platform to ask your question. It doesn't even have to be a question. You can just make an observation or a comment. I'm going to ask you, please, we're not in the same room, so that means there is some distance between us, and it's very difficult to sometimes know who's speaking and what they want to say. I'm going to ask those of you who are participating and listening in today to please make your questions just brief and succinct, say who you are, but also most importantly, tell me to whom you are directing that question so that I can facilitate nicely. I hope that's very, very clear. Let me introduce you to my panelists this afternoon. Tsitsi Masiyiwa. Now, Tsitsi is our keynote speaker. She's an African philanthropist and social entrepreneur. She is executive chair and co-founder of HigherLife Foundation. And the primary goal, of course, is to invest in human capital development and build thriving individuals, communities, and organizations. And as I said to my panelists earlier, your resumes are all sterling. I didn't know which part of it to highlight, but you are welcome, Tsitsi. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll also be joined this afternoon by Dr. Bhekinkosi Moyo. Dr. Moyo is a writer, a researcher, and thought leader who has really championed the African discourse on philanthropy. And this is one such contribution, and very involved in the formation of African civil society, and has taken part in most of, in continental processes of development and governance. It's a pleasure to have you with us. We have Gill, who also joins us, CEO, Charities Aid Foundation, Southern Africa. Solid experience in the corporate, parastatal, and non-profit space, and she has managed trusts and foundations of companies listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And I suspect, Gill, I've interviewed you before on the radio, but if not, welcome to this platform. It's great to be with you. We also have Jacob Madi, who is the author and senior lecturer at the Plaatje University. And Jacob has written some very instructive articles on philanthropy, has researched and published on a wide range of topics, blending professional experience from academia, civil society, and also consulting. It's also a pleasure to have you with us, Jacob, and welcome. Masego, Madzwamuse, thank you very much for joining us, and CEO of Southern Africa Trust. I think we all know who the Southern Africa Trust is, and it's a civil society involvement, a social justice activist and practitioner in the development and economic space with over 20 years experience, extensive experience working with civil society, community foundations, and non-profit sector. Thank you so very much for joining us. Let me hand over to Tsitsi Masiyiwa to open the discussion for us. We cannot wait to hear about this journey, about the practice of philanthropy and social investment in Africa.
Thank you very much, Redi, and a very big congratulations to Dr. Bhekinkosi Moyo. This is your day. This is the day we are celebrating something that is massively exciting for us as philanthropists, the communities in which we serve in, and the whole body of academic experts, researchers, friends, givers, everybody, to just recognize just how special this particular day is. So well done. Today we are celebrating the launch of the first ever International Review of Philanthropy and Social Investment, Volume 1, Number 1, of a start of a series. So it's a first on the continent, and also a first, I think, in the global world of philanthropy. Why? Because we have our very own publication, which is written by Africans about Africa from an African and global perspective, because a lot of the writers and the contributors to the articles are people who have worked globally, so they understand philanthropy not just from an African lens, but through an African lens from a global perspective. So what an honor and a privilege. I think we have something worth celebrating. We are in a global crisis. COVID has hit every single country in the world, and there's very little, I think many times when you read in the media, very little to celebrate. But I want to say today, let's take a sit back and take time to just celebrate something that is so important to all of us. Now, I also just want to mention that for me, the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment, which is based at Wits Business School in Johannesburg, South Africa, is also a very important, authentic voice of the work that is done by different types of philanthropists. What's important is, what I love is the way in which the center has been able to amplify the voices and celebrate all forms of philanthropy. So it's not just about strategic philanthropy or high net worth individuals giving to philanthropy. It recognizes the importance of individuals, the importance of community, giving at community level, the importance of the diaspora in helping to meet the pressing challenges that we face in our communities. For me, the journal is a beacon of light and celebrates the diversity in the way in which we do our giving. Africa has a lot of pain points that have been really just worsened by, like I said, the COVID global crisis. We have difficulties with lockdowns in an environment where our incomes, people live on very little, $1 a day. What we earn on a day is what we spend on. So the pressures of what we have to do to overcome a COVID environment is more so hard pressing in our communities. We also have very fragile, very poor health systems that make it very difficult to meet the demands that are required for us to confront COVID in a more effective way. But I'm sure all of us, everybody has had their own first-hand experience. But on a positive side, for me, what excites me is that the body of knowledge that is being launched today gives us the opportunity to discuss in a methodical, systematic, and informed manner. What has worked in philanthropy? Where are the gaps? How do we find an authentic and strong African voice that defines, respects, and takes fully into account first of all, the communities that we serve? They are at the center of what we do. Without those communities, there's no philanthropy. Then secondly, the nature in which philanthropy is done on the continent. When I got into philanthropy without even understanding the term philanthropy itself or having read anything on giving, it was something that was driven by the needs I saw in the community. I went into philanthropy with my family, not because we had money, we didn't have anything. It was the heart first and the desire, the vision, the mission before the resources. And I have to say that culture is something that came out of the environment in which many of us have been brought up. All of us found it normal to look after extended family, to share meager resources we had as we were growing up. So that the definition of philanthropy for us was pretty much steeped in our culture, the communities from which we came from, and the love and respect we had for one another. And as I have seen philanthropy develop on the continent, I think many times we've felt the pressure of trying to copy a model that is Western, driven by historical contexts that come out of Europe and the United States. And which fundamentally is driven, yes, by love of humanity, but also by a lot of laws, incentives, and regulations that award people for giving. Now, we come from a continent where we don't give because of tax incentives or because of laws and regulations. Our giving is very much driven by the level to which we are connected to the people and the communities in which we serve. So I think for me, having then an organization, an institution that captures from an academic and evidence-based approach to giving, it really gives us the important platform we need to redefine what the models should be like, to redefine what measurement of success or effective, impactful philanthropy looks like, and also provides us an opportunity to tap into sources of resources that are sensitive and that are matched to the way in which our communities live and the way our communities are structured. So Dr. Bheki, I want to celebrate the amazing cohort of the first class of 2020. We will always remember you because of COVID. So this journal is super special. And I think, honestly, I would just love to say congratulations to everybody by name. So well done, Tendai Murisa, Chengete Chakamera, Jacob Mwati Mati, well done, Halima Mohammed. A big shout out to Muazu Ibrahim and Imhotep Paul Alagidede, Wycliffe Nduga, Uma, Sposami Malunga, Gill Gates, and Louise Denishan. Well done and congratulations. Thank you for bringing such knowledge, dignity, and integrity to African philanthropy. I want to end by saying to everybody who's on the platform, please make sure that we download, we buy, we invest, and we give towards this important work, which will define the way and the direction in which philanthropy will shape the African continent.
Okay, I don't know if we've lost you there or if the connection has just gone slow. Tsitsi, are you still with us? Okay, I think his screen has just frozen. If you are still listening, we'd love for you to come back and be a part of our conversation. But thank you very much for your passion, for those inspiring words, and we all add our voices to congratulate those who contributed. So let me bring in Dr. Bhekinkosi Moyo. You know, I'm very, very keen to know about the development of the journal itself and what you hope its future will be, but in also sharing that we are galvanized into action based on our situations and our observations. You are an academic, you are a researcher, you must have observed something or seen something that needed to be addressed. Hence, we are here today. Can you share that background with us and tell us more about how the journal was developed?
Thank you very much, Redi. And I know that Imhotep, the chief editor, has also joined.
Oh,
so I'll talk more about the process and our future. And he will talk more about the content of the journal. So I want to start by acknowledging that this journey has been a long one for us, especially for those who are working in the philanthropic space. Simply because for a very long time, we did not have a lot written on Africa by Africans. And yet we know that wherever we have grown up, we have always been raised and been exposed to various forms of philanthropy. And so, you know, this journey has really included a number of institutions, some of which are represented, I think, in this event, mainly the African philanthropic foundations, where this whole journey started in the early 2000s, where a lot of institutions came together through the leadership of Trust Africa, the African Women Development Fund, the Kenya Community Development Foundation, the Southern Africa Trust, among others, to put together a platform that would act more or less as a group for peer learning and sharing of practices and lessons on African philanthropy or philanthropy in Africa. And so that led to the formation of what was called the African Grantmakers Network and then the African Philanthropy Network. And one of the programs there was research, and we realized that there wasn't much that was written on African philanthropy. And so we started doing some work on researching on African practices and forms of philanthropy. And so our first book, which was published through the Amalion Press with the help of Trust Africa, was the first defining publication on philanthropy in Africa. But that was not enough, because we also wanted to make sure that our research is peer reviewed. It also receives the same academic credibility that other journals or other reports that we would get would actually have. And so the quest to then start thinking about a center or a chair in African philanthropy began. And the long story short, we ended up at the Wits Business School. And so I'm positioning the journal within the broader global studies on philanthropic studies, in that we were filling a gap that existed in the continent. And we wanted to do so by setting up a center that would not only do research, but would also teach, but would also offer a platform for African researchers and academics and practitioners to actually publish. Those of you who read international journals will know how difficult it is for African researchers to actually publish in those global platforms. And so this was an important gap for us to also fill, in the sense that we want our material to be read universally and internationally, but we were not getting as much publications coming out in the global North-based journals. And so this was for us an opportunity to create a platform for African researchers and practitioners to begin sharing their own stories in their own way, in ways that would resonate with the constituency in Africa. So this is really the idea of the journal, and we are going to do more and more of these issues. And so the establishment of the center itself took into account a holistic view. We are a Pan-African center, and so that means all our programs have to take a Pan-African lens. But secondly, we were worried that if we just introduce academic programs where we just teach, that would be good, but it won't be enough, because we still have to make sure that what we teach is disseminated. But we also needed to make sure that we are teaching is actually African and is African knowledge. And so we had to do research in the continent and across the continent so that we can provide content that resonates with Africans. We are not doing away with international forms of philanthropy and publications, but we are just making sure that when we say we are teaching African philanthropy, we are using examples that are generated from the continent. And so, research was a second element that, the center would focus on. But we also were aware that we don't want to just remain an academic platform in a university without any roots in practice. And so the idea of involving practitioners in the programming of the center, but also in the journal itself, is really much a character and a feature of the center, in that we want practitioners to actually inform theory and some of the academic pieces that will come out. But at the same time, we also want academics to be able to work with practitioners and help them to theorize the work that they are doing and potentially put it into written form so that it doesn't just exist in the heads of those experienced practitioners out there, but there's an opportunity for them to reflect on their day-to-day work. And we build a hub and a knowledge base that future generations will come back to and use this to begin telling the narrative of African expressions of philanthropy in the continent. So in terms of going forward, we really want to make this journal credible. Those of you who are in the publishing world, you would know that it will take a couple of years for our journal to be credible. We are aware that this is the beginning of a long journey for us. The real work has just begun. And so there are a couple of things that we have put in place to try and make sure that our journal is respected internationally, that over time we are going to be beginning to apply for accreditation, indexing, among others. But just to give you a sense of what we have just done right now, we have made it easier for authors and reviewers in the next issue by putting in place an editorial manager platform, which will allow for easy submission, but also for the allocation of duties to editors and reviewers, which is automated basically to track, in terms of time, among others. So the first phase of a journal production is just going to be done through that platform, and then we'll go to the next phase, which is the production phase. And we do have our colleague who will be working with everyone here, Xolani, who is part of the journal. And those of you that want to know more about our processes, Xolani will be able to provide that. The other thing that we have done for the journalists is to actually have it as an open access journal. And so we have published it through Subnet, and we want to thank our partner Subnet by agreeing to partner with us on this. So Subnet is a platform that publishes a number of African journals, and you can just subscribe and have access to those journals. And so we wanted to put our journal in that platform so that it can be widely disseminated and popularized. The third thing that we have done is to make sure that it is both available in online, but also in print for the first issue. But going forward, we will as you know, the publishing world has just gone digital. We will try and keep our publications online. But for our first issue, we just want to have a copy of a physical hard copy that we can share with our partners across the world. For authors, we have also made sure that they can actually find ways of making sure that all their publications are recognized across different platforms. And so we are a member of Crossref through Subnet. We have also done reference cross-linking, as well as created OCAD and DOI links for authors, which makes it really easy for authors to have a profile and put together all their publications in one space. And so all these are ways of trying to make the journal going forward more credible, to allow us the opportunity to also compete internationally with other journals that are already in existence. But like I said, this is really the beginning for us. And I will probably at this point stop, because my colleague, who is the chief editor, basically has the final word, not me. Thank you so much, Redi.
Thanks so much, and we will carry on with the program. I had not introduced Professor Imhotep Alagidede, Editor-in-Chief and Professor at Wits Business School. It's a pleasure to have you with us. He's a meta-economist and a transdisciplinary scholar who's an entrepreneur, accomplished academic, and a seasoned consultant. We can't wait to hear about the editorial development. What can we expect, and what does it all mean for our grasp, understanding of African philanthropy?
Thanks be to the Almighty for this wonderful spring day of 1st September. Thank you all for joining us, and we want to acknowledge the enormous help and support that we receive from the Almighty and all the ancestors. So as our sister said earlier, today is really a very powerful day, and we are very grateful that you've all joined us in the launch of this special communication tool that we call the International Review on Philanthropy and Social Investment. And it's a very great honor for me to edit it. We come together with over 15 years of experience in editing top-class international journals. And so you would see from the Subnet platform that this journal has actually hit the ground running. It's very rare for new journals to start this way. And so the enormous support that we receive from all the funders, the incredible energy behind the scheme from Becky and everybody at the center has made it possible for us to start this way. And I'm really grateful for the help that all of you have given to us. And we are counting on your support as we go forward. So you would see that the first issue has really come out very strong, and we are very proud of it. We have a collection of 6 full-length articles. Actually, one didn't make it, but it will make it to the next issue. And in addition to that is a couple of field notes that we collected from practitioners in the field. So this is a message that we've already communicated. This is not just an academic writing type of scheme. We appreciate that philanthropy has many sides. So the journal itself starts as, if you like, a general interest philanthropy journal. By general interest, I mean that we appreciate the views and contributions from all fields, from sociology to philanthropy itself, economics, all the social sciences, humanities, and the mainstream sciences that speak to the main themes that we do at the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment. So what makes a journal a good journal? It's mainly about the editorial protocols that you put in place, the quality of the research output that goes into it, and how that research output influences policy and also society in general. And we started off by looking at what can we do in order to put the African voice out. It has already been said, Africans' voice is very less represented in places like this, especially even in terms of mobilizing funds for development. So the narrative surrounding our continent and surrounding the myriads of problems that we face is normally communicated and written for us by others. And this is a change in the dynamic. We've done a lot of surveys around what is already there in the field of third sector philanthropy and social investment. And we haven't found anything similar to what we are proposing or we have just launched. So we want to use this as a mouthpiece to change the narrative on Africa generally. not just on philanthropy, but development and every aspect of African life. So indigenous knowledge, indigenous forms of giving and development, indigenous ways of looking at things, alternative paradigms to development, and a general engagement with scholars, both within the continent and outside of the continent, and then collaborating with other mouthpieces in a similar direction is what we are aiming to take this forward. So we have field notes, we have regular articles, we will be publishing book reviews, comments, opinion pieces, and etc. And all this is really to boost the work of the center. We so far have over 10 PhD students and a number of master students. A lot of the research that is coming out will find it difficult to get into regular international journals, as Becky has already mentioned. But we also understand the process of what a good article looks like. So this is also a practical education tool for our students to begin to learn how to put research in a scholarly fashion out there. So in general, we are more interested in putting this project as a very excellent platform for thorough scholarly research, competent and relevant work on African philanthropy and generally African development. And we look forward to a lot of collaboration from everyone so that we make this a very strong journal. You will, from us, we will promise that we will have regular issues. We won't, because another thing to note about journal publishing is you publish today and then tomorrow there's nothing to publish. So we have already created enough traffic through, we'll be having special issues where we'll tackle specific topics, and we will keep this running in a very competent way. So I won't talk much. We'll take maybe comments and questions later on when colleagues want to find out more about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. We look forward to that. I was smiling and laughing at the same time when you started speaking, because you said happy spring day, and there you are with your big scarf and your big coat, and we all have, you know,
that's right.
The irony of it. Happy spring day, and we are freezing cold, eh?
I'm still waiting for the sun to appear.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Prof. And you mentioned, of course, the editorial development, the journey, the collaboration, and you mentioned the field notes that make up part of the journal. And Gill, with that, I'd like to introduce you so you can give us a bit more insight on the field notes themselves. What stood out?
Thank you so much, Redi, for that introduction, and a very good afternoon to you, colleagues. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you in conversation today, and I'd like to extend congratulations from CAPSI to Professor Moyo and his team for today's launch. Becky shared with me that this has been 2 years in the making, so I know there'll be many late nights, and just want to congratulate the entire team for this amazing production. I'd also like to recognize the contribution of all authors to this important journal, which I know will be instructive in respect of deepening our collective practices in this space. Colleagues, CAPSI really wanted to share our thoughts on adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic and how we had to adjust our systems as we moved emergency philanthropy money into South Africa and in South Africa. We wanted really to also highlight both the challenges and the opportunities in unlocking emergency philanthropic funds for the sector. Colleagues, for many of you who don't know, or some of you may not know, CAPSI is a philanthropy and civil society infrastructure organization. So effectively that means that CAPSI operates at the intersection between philanthropy and civil society. And our role as an intermediary means that our fundamental reason for being is to champion and to grow philanthropic and charitable giving to the nonprofit sector. So CAPSI also advises our corporate and philanthropic donors on making donations quickly and safely. CAPSI also historically uses evidence-based research in respect of guiding our donors, and we are a proud member of the CAF Global Alliance, which is a collective of locally led infrastructure organizations operating across 10 countries. So, colleagues, we wanted to share the learnings that we have made in this process of moving emergency funding. We needed to look specifically at our readiness to receive and allocate funds. Now, CAPSI has been in this role for over 20 years in the country. One of our strongest value propositions to both our nonprofit and our corporate clients is our very, very robust governance, compliance, and financial systems and requirements. So that means that effectively we already have payment mechanisms in place. We have very, very strong databases of vetted South African nonprofit organizations. We have access to further databases as well as civil society organizations who are active on the ground. Our reporting and monitoring and auditing processes are solid, and those nominated organizations who might not have been through our vetting process during this emergency time, we quickly managed to validate these organizations in order to assist them to become eligible to receive donor funding. So what was the very first challenge that we came across in this process? Well, we very quickly had to learn a very hard lesson, and that was we had to manage the conflicting needs and requirements of the donor and the NPO. And colleagues, I cannot tell you how difficult and challenging this was. We also learned that actually managing this tension is a natural state in a situation like this, because different entities have different needs and requirements. So we had to ensure, the opportunity here was we had to manage that tension in order to ensure that philanthropic funds were managed with diligence and care, so that such funds were directed to where they were most desperately needed. So this brings me to our second learning, colleagues, and that is the need to balance agility with compliance. And we also realized very quickly that this is a very complicated and delicate balancing act. So CAPSI, during this time of moving emergency funds into the nonprofit sector, had to look at managing risk. We obviously had to look at managing reputation, and obviously we had to be mindful of regulatory compliance. Both the donor and the recipient obviously had to be protected during this critical process. And the lesson learned was that ultimately CAPSI needed to adapt its historically strict due diligence process so that emergency funding could be moved quickly, but also meeting the amended compliance requirements. CAPSI was unable to perform physical site visits during this time. And usually CAPSI has a very long list of requirements from recipient organizations. We require organizations to submit their founding documents, their MOUs, their list of directors, their most recent audited financial statements. We quickly realized, colleagues, that this wasn't going to work in the emergency situation that we found ourselves in. So CAPSI had to learn to be flexible. We had to learn to be agile, and we got our requirements in this instance.
Are you still there, Jill? Okay.
Apologies.
Oh, there you are. There you are.
Okay. So we had to reduce this very long list of requirements to a basic list of 3 requirements. We needed the organizations to give us proof of their registration. We needed, obviously, proof of a permit to operate. And we needed proof of banking details. And this process then meant that we could move funds very, very quickly as they were needed. Colleagues, we also had to look at compliance in respect of community-based organizations. Moving emergency funding has highlighted a number of fault lines in the current compliance criteria. CBOs and small volunteer organizations and movements, which are most often closest to those individuals, groups, and communities who are most in need, are excluded for consideration from funding in this type of instance. Such barriers to access must immediately be addressed by philanthropy infrastructure organizations. These CBOs lack resources, expertise, and the time to do the compliance work. And in many instances, we found to reach these organizations to start these discussions, they were simply unavailable because they were actually just too busy doing the work. So we realized that we had to look at that, and that is something that is receiving our urgent attention. Colleagues, in conclusion, The COVID-19 pandemic has unleashed unprecedented socio-economic consequences for those most marginalized families and communities in South Africa. It has further exposed the existing fault lines of poverty, inequality, and unemployment in South Africa. Now more than ever before, South Africa requires the collaborative efforts, flexibility, resources, and the best thinking of civil society, government, and the private sector as actors in concert to respond with agility, professionalism, and care. Colleagues, research has shown that civil society survival is at risk if support is not provided right now. This is absolutely crucial, both in terms of managing the current crisis response, but also to ensure that civil society continues to play a pivotal role in the post-COVID-19 rebuilding efforts. The Growing Giving in South Africa research report that was released by CAPSI in February 2020 only highlighted that the challenges and opportunities presented have only been amplified during the crisis. The recommendations in February, colleagues, and remember February was just before the onset of the lockdown. The calls then in this report from the non-profit sector were a need for flexibility, a need for agility, and a need for unrestricted funding into the sector. So colleagues, in conclusion, the powerful combination of agility and compliance in the distribution of philanthropic funds can and must be leveraged to support those who are most vulnerable and marginalized in our society, as the complexities of the pandemic are navigated and our country is readied for a world forever changed. Colleagues, thank you for letting me share these thoughts and learnings, and I hope that they are helpful to you in your practice. Thank you, Redi.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. And you used such stirring words about agility, flexibility, compliance. And in this time of emergency, how do you make sure that those who are in desperate need of funds are visible, that they are seen, that they are assisted to be compliant? And I was just thinking, Gill, as you were speaking and taking us through that and the impact of COVID on the global economy, that in this context of inequality, where our economies were just trudging along, the impact is felt even more acutely. And even as you were speaking, that some of the articles that I browsed through as I prepared for this momentous occasion are in conversation with each other. I was thinking about the article that analyzed corporate social responsibility of non-African founded multinational corporations, and reflecting on the size of the corporation and the relationship with the extent, I suppose, of corporate social responsibility and what that will look like in a post-COVID world. And with that, I welcome Jacob Mati, who will discuss or give us an overview of some of the specific articles on philanthropy in the journal, and fascinated as well, Jacob, by why these particular articles and why these particular themes. Welcome. Jacob, it's your turn. Can you unmute yourself? Oh, there we go.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Thank you, everyone, the panelists, the moderator, for the opportunity. In so many ways, this is a dream come true for quite a good number of us on this particular continent who have been interested in philanthropy, but not just philanthropy. I usually don't tell people that I'm a philanthropy researcher. I think I research pro-social behavior with huge leanings on what happens in our midst on the African continent. It is because of that that the type of work that I do, but probably all people on this particular continent will find connections between various aspects. The editor-in-chief is an economics professor who is working on this. Moyo is a political scientist who finds himself working on this. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say here is if we look at the articles in this inaugural issue, they speak to all these various aspects that are quite important. I think this has been made, the point has been made. I don't need to belabor on the same. What I'm going to do is probably speak a little bit about my own article, because that's probably what I know most about, even though also before speaking to that, briefly mention some of the things, because I have been involved in this process. These papers were presented in one form or another in previous conversations at the center over the last year or so. So we'll find that they do speak to various aspects. My article is the first one after the editor's note, then it's followed by Halima Mohammed's, and what she does is she speaks or tries to make some reflections on how institutional philanthropy is helping with popular organizing across Africa. And you find this quite important in the sense that in some instances, what these social movements are trying to do is to fight the social injustices and issues of inequality that do exist in our midst. And therefore, traditional philanthropists might be hesitant to approach or to even touch these types of organizing. Nonetheless, we have philanthropists who have been bold enough to support these particular struggles, because there are struggles against structural injustices or structural issues that require concerted efforts and huge amounts of resources to be able to do that. Tadai Mrisa's article is important in the sense that it tries to tell us exactly what's happening in traditional contexts, in rural contexts in Zimbabwe. And you find every time I read articles like this, I find myself reflecting on what happens in the villages I grew up in, because they are similar in so many ways. But it's also, I think Professor Becky and Professor Imhotep have already alluded to this, and I think Mrs. Masiyiwa has also alluded to this, in the sense that sometimes when we go to these international conferences, or sometimes submit an article and you're trying to make a case that there's something that we may call philanthropy in those rural settings, when the popular image in certain parts of the media is one where it doesn't sound like there's anyone helping who can be out there to help. But these are pro-social behaviors, and they do exist in every single society, whether it's a rich society or a poor society. And I think these are some of the things that make this exciting, in the sense that we can be able to tell our stories as we see them, without them being filtered through lenses that may not necessarily give us what we want at the end of the day. The other full article is it looks at corporate philanthropy and the value chain by Oma. And I think, again, does bring important connections between the corporate sector or the corporate world in our continent, and what it does in terms of social investments. It's by then the next one is Chakamera, again an important one that also speaks to corporate social responsibility and whatever is happening between African, what he calls internalizers. That's companies that are African in origin but are international in sense, and also national corporations that have origins from elsewhere, outside of the continent. Then lastly, of the larger articles is by Ibrahim and Alagidede. Again, they look at NGO activities and local government spending. So they try to see who is complementing or substituting. So it's an important debate. And what I do in my own article is to try and theorize. It's a very sociological piece, to try and theorize, or rather to try and make theoretical meaning of all these various types of practices that are represented in these particular articles, and even the pieces, the practitioner pieces that do come later. And in a way, the story that Bates has been telling, that particular agility, it's a story that is probably not told quite often with regards to the context within which we exist. The question that I try to respond to is basically one asks, why do we have people giving? Because again, the giving surveys by CAF again, and as well as other organizations in Kenya. My study is based in Kenya. Tells us that Kenyans do give a lot. About 92% of Kenyans do give in one form or another. So why do they give? Try to understand what giving is and the type of philanthropy that exists. I argue that that story can be told if we look at individual agency, definitely, but also more importantly, we look at the structures within that giving exist, or why people would be compelled to give. But what I mean by structure is when you look at, let's say, in a place where there is plenty, people may help each other to make merry. In places where there is scarcity, people may help each other, or those few that have a little will give each other to help them get by. And we see all these forms of social institutions, if you will, at play at various levels in our societies. Here in South Africa, the Stokvels and many others that do help people get by. I think, looking at my story, one of the corporates, the most successful corporates in Kenya, for instance, the Safaricom, has probably made more money because they realized that some of these gadgets were not meant to only serve rich people who have money. It's because they invested in technologies that are able to help people move money, very little amounts of money, to one another. So this, through the M-Pesa, we're all familiar with this. And in a sense, it has become a platform that is able to help. But Mrs. Masiyiwa talked about earlier about the incentivizing or incentivization of giving in Western contexts. We see in Africa, yes, there are laws and regulations that increasingly are probably incentivizing. And nonetheless, this has been happening irrespective of or despite the absence of these particular laws. Yes, we are learning from where laws started to be formed in terms of formal giving, but informally, we have also had laws that require you from our own African worldviews, the Ubuntu or Hutu or such other traditions. So this is what this particular article tries to do and theorize all those particular practices. And the basic point that I essentially make is to be able to understand these particular practices and the environment, we need to look at the complex interplay of individual agency and the structures that incentivize or quote unquote coerce people to give, even when you don't want to give, and you have a starving neighbor and you have a full granary of grains, you definitely don't want to watch as they die. So you give whatever little you have. And so I think I'll leave it at that because it's and probably to give us time to also have some conversation instead of us talking to each other. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Appreciate it, Jacob. And yes, we are going to make room and space for interaction and conversation. Again, let me just remind our participants, those who are watching and following this fascinating discussion and this historic moment, the launch of the International Review of Philanthropy and Social Investment Journal, the first of its kind, a very Pan-African project and initiative, and long may it live. much needed as well, based on the speakers that we have just heard thus far. Let me just remind you to please use the Q&A button or function of this platform to put through your thoughts, your questions, your comments. And if there is a question, it would be really helpful if you would leave your name, but also be specific about where I should direct this particular question. So, Masego, you know, I gave an introduction earlier about being on the radio and straddling, you know, that platform of conversation and dialogue with people from across different sectors. And I have to admit that often when it came to philanthropy and social investment, we spoke to the givers, we spoke to the philanthropists, we spoke to the big corporates. They got the visibility. Yes, there was a lot of generosity, of course, in responding to the urgent needs in society, but there was something in return. You know, the stature rose in the eyes of the public, and perhaps in the eyes of shareholders, in the eyes of investors, in the eyes of customers. So there was a financial benefit, I'm sure, to giving. And very seldom do we speak to civil society on the ground to find out how they want to receive the help and the expertise, to find out who are the voices in the community and what story do they have to tell, apart from just being at the receiving end of a philanthropic act. What is their agency right there on the ground, and how can they be empowered? So I look forward to your contribution, discussing the relevance of this journal in particular on the civil society sector. Go for it, Masego.
Thank you, Redi, and no pressure there with with that introduction. I'd really like to start by as well congratulating Becky and Professor Imhotep on you know, the launch of this journal. As Becky said, it's been a long journey, and one that is quite beautiful to have observed over the years. Something that translates from ideation in our continent by our very own people, and seeing it translate into tangible outcomes, such as we are observing. You know, the teaching modules that CAPSI has introduced, and culminating in this journal itself. So this is it's a moment to sit back, to watch with pride what colleagues and comrades have been able to achieve. So congratulations there, Becky and colleagues. And like you were saying there, Redi, I think that the utility of the journal goes beyond the academic circles. It's of great use and contribution to the civil society space. And in the introduction chapter of the journal itself, Becky talks about the moment at which this journal is being launched, and he talks about you know, the moment in history where civil society is once again finding itself navigating the quagmire of funding. We find ourselves in these moments quite a lot with natural disasters as you speak, but this is one that is at a scale that we never imagined. It's at multiple scales. And it actually also comes at a time when already civil society had to grapple with the changes in the funding landscape and with the reduction of aid coming to the continent. And it comes at a time where it finds us at our weakest in terms of institutional funding to be able to respond and play that frontline role that Gill was speaking about when she started talking about connecting aid and philanthropy funding to the NGOs on the ground, the community foundations, the communities in need. So we have a lot of questions that, yes, we've been on the receiving end of philanthropy and development aid for quite a long time, but it does not necessarily mean that we understand the art of social giving. It doesn't mean that we understand how we get to a point where questions of social justice can gain traction with the corporate sector, with individual givers, particularly in our continent. So the space of understanding African philanthropy in a concerted manner and through scholarship is relatively new. And I am quite encouraged to see that we are getting to a space where we can begin to create a common language, a common understanding, and concepts that will enhance how we unlock the evidence that informs the grant making that we do, but also that informs how we connect givers to communities on the ground. But most importantly, what I like about the journal is this idea of understanding the politics of knowledge production. Yes. And the politics of academia, and approaching the journal from a political economy perspective and saying, hang on, this is not just a space for academics. It's also a space for giving voice. What is called field notes, for me, that's the heart of the visibility of communities, and understanding that the so-called recipients of aid and philanthropy are also agents of social change. And therefore, if we spend time in understanding what the needs are, in understanding how giving can be done differently so that it connects to that public accountability, then we begin to structure African philanthropy, which has been with us over millennia, in a way that is structured and begins to give and guide some of the long-term solutions that we are all seeking to address poverty, inequality, and give direction to our sense of development from an African perspective. So that understanding of creating space for African voices and acknowledging that African voices matter in this discourse, I think is quite important. Becky talked about the difficulties in getting space to publish in journals. I would also say it's also the difficulties in getting the value of citizen journalism understood and appreciated. We saw a lot with the COVID responses, a lot of articles that were coming in, particularly in the philanthropy space. Other people trying to articulate what the needs on the continent were, the direction of the continent, and the few African voices that were trying to penetrate that space were often told, we've already had 2 articles on the continent, and at the moment, that is, we don't think that is what we need. But going back to differentiating those African voices, going to the communities, going to the NGOs, capturing the stories so that they inform the structure of social giving, I think is something powerful. So I'm quite glad that there's that space that is given to what we are talking about when we talk about the field notes. But it also speaks to understanding philanthropic behavior, and what Tsitsi started with when she talked about her own journey in philanthropy, and she was saying we were giving from the heart. It wasn't necessarily because we had this grand concept of what philanthropy is, but that connection to the heart is also dependent on actually understanding what the needs are from the voices of those who are directly affected with very little interception. So there's great value in being able to capture the voices of community foundations, being able to capture the voices of community-based organizations, the civil society organizations and NGOs that have been on the forefront of development. I don't want to go on for too long, but I think that I want to land where Gill was talking about, and I think Becky also talked about it when he spoke about credibility. It's actually in the transparency of the data. We are in many aspects an oral society, but that should not take away from the idea of being able to document in the different forms, being able to document the lessons from the field, to document the nuances that come in, but also to capture the questions that CBOs themselves are grappling with, so that the research agenda can connect with those realities. And to just end by saying that when we talk about philanthropy in the African context, for us it's important to always connect back to philanthropy towards what end. And our engagement is about driving the development agenda, as I said, and in a way that drives sustainability, is people-centered, and is providing long-term solutions for addressing poverty and inequality. And through the journal, I quite like the idea that we are reclaiming our space, reclaiming our voices, and in a way, inviting the rest of the world to join us rather than do for us. We know what the problems are. We've got the ideas, what the solutions are, and we are grateful for the space to be able to articulate our ideas.
Thank you so very much for that very powerful delivery. And I think I'm just going to, start the Q&A by picking on a theme that you articulated so passionately, and the speakers before you also did. Of course, we know that there is knowledge inequality. Of course, we know that often the door is closed to African narratives. I get very frustrated when I switch on the TV and some international broadcasters are only focusing on our calamities, or they are depicting Africans who are just dancing and having a good time, but never what we contribute to the global market of ideas. I must be honest, I'm astounded that this also happens in philanthropy. Let me tell you why. I assumed that this was one sector, perhaps, that was insulated from that kind of knowledge inequality, because we know that there are a whole lot of international and even African multinationals that are involved in philanthropy. I would have thought that it would come with a modicum of humility and understanding of the communities in which they work. We are spoken about in conversations as the global south, as the dark continent, whatever it is. I would have thought that in this particular sector, there would be much more respect for what our researchers, our societies, our academics have to offer in this space. But Dr. Bheki, maybe let's just start there. I'm just sitting here stunned. Of course, you guys know far more about that than I do, but I really did take for granted that when it comes to philanthropy, because even when COVID started, they were not interviewing any of our African scientists, our academics. It was international speakers, predicting what was going to happen on the African continent. But when it comes to philanthropy, given that we are the poorest continent, I would have thought that they'll have some curiosity about what players like yourself have to bring to the global market of ideas. Can you just give me a comment on that?
Thank you, Redi. I just want to start by apologizing for the visuals. I've just been load shed here, so.
Oh, shame. Sorry about that.
But at least I managed to switch to data, and so I'm here. So I think that's a very interesting point to start the discussion on, because as soon as COVID hit our shores, one of the first things that we wanted to understand as the center was, the impact that COVID would have on philanthropy, on corporates, as well as on the non-profit sector in general. And so we started tracking some of those impacts because we wanted to be sure that at some point when questions like this come up, we are able to give some data and some narratives that are emerging from the field. But we were also equally interested in the response, to COVID-19 by our own philanthropists, our own non-profit sector, as well as our corporates. And I think one of the things that we know is that when it comes to knowledge and knowledge production, it's important who does the gathering of data, who does the actual writing, and for what purposes. And so, I think sitting at the center, we are aware of the inequalities when it comes to knowledge production, but also to the ways in which narratives are actually created and spread along. But one of the things that we actually noticed from across the countries where we are doing some of the work is that, there was a tendency for our philanthropists, by that I mean our African foundations and African high net worth individuals, to more or less behave like what our governments did. Our government, dug in and decided to look internally and focus on just serving their own citizens. And that's what most of the philanthropists actually did. I mean, of course, there are some that looked regional and in a Pan-African way. And that for us signaled, a gap that we wanted to try and highlight, that, it's important to not just focus within, but to take a Pan-African and a regional integration perspective when it comes to dealing with pandemics of this nature. And we had been here before. So, when the cyclone struck in Malawi, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and the Ebola pandemic that happened a couple of years ago, we tried to understand what was happening. And like you said, the first thing that we got to know about it was the response by the international community. But when you went down into digging what happened, you always realize that the first people to respond to a disaster, to a pandemic, are locals. But they don't get the visibility that they deserve. And so part of what we wanted to do with this work is to actually showcase that and begin to tell the stories of the locals. And so we have a project, and I saw a question, at some point I'll come back to it, from Maurice Omondi, asking how do we reach our own high net worth individuals, among others. We have a project that we currently are implementing across 30 countries, where we are studying the character and the philanthropy of high net worth individuals. We want to understand how they give, why do they give, to whom do they give, what strategies do they consider when giving, among others, and what is the most important thing that they consider when they decide they want to give, and is giving cross border important to them, or they just want to give back to things that are very close to them at family level or within the communities. So once the study is consolidated, again we'll come back to share some of those results. But I think the main point is that from our side, we really want to reverse the trend where local responses only come to be recognized very late in the game, when they're actually the first to respond to any pandemic that happens on the ground. And COVID-19 has actually shown that communities are at the center of the resolution of this pandemic. Without communities, government can do whatever it wants, but it won't succeed. And so the power of community engagement is an important element of how we all grow up. Solidarity, reciprocity, among others, are the features of what define an African philanthropy and African expression of solidarity.
Thank you, Dr. Moyo. I think I am going to ask that question anyway. I know you touched on aspects of it. Maurice Omondi sending us a question from Tangaza University College in Kenya. How best can, because he addressed it to either you or Gill Bates or Dr. Mati. So let me ask it. How best can academia/research contribute to practical growth of philanthropy in Africa? For example, how best can we reach out to rich individuals and encourage them to contribute to philanthropy and social investment based on the knowledge that we have gained about them? So between Gill and Dr. Mati, who wants to take that one? Gill, do you want to?
Well, I have a first stab at it. Yes, can you hear me?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, all right, I'll just take a first stab at it and then leave it to my colleague. I think the question of research has come up a lot, and certainly research is what guides CAPSI's practice. And so every year, CAPS releases a World Giving Index report that measures generosity across countries throughout the world. So they measure generosity behaviors such as giving donations, giving time, helping a stranger. And in 2019, there was a 10-year consolidated report on just giving behaviors across the world. And it was really interesting for us to see that Africa is rising. And you mentioned really the gap between the so-called global north and the global south. Well, that is closing in terms of generosity behaviors. And the report found that of the most improved countries for generosity behaviors was that Kenya came second, South Africa came sixth, and Rwanda came eighth. So in fact, there were 8 African countries that recorded a higher rate of generosity patterns. So for us, we just thought this was an absolute victory for Africa. Africa is most definitely rising, our challenges notwithstanding. And I think these are really, really encouraging results.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mati, would you like to address an aspect of that question or just add your comments, please?
Just to add a few comments. Thank you, my colleague Bates, for for what you just said. It's, but I would actually take a slightly different perspective on this. I don't think Africa is rising. We have always been there. It's the way our stories have been told that puts us at the bottom. I'll make that case because a couple of years ago, in 2010, 2011, I was involved in a study that was published as the first the State of the World's Volunteering Report. We commissioned at the time, with the UNV, United Nations Volunteers, we commissioned a study, and at the time, we were told there are no stories to tell about giving, either of time or money from the African continent. But we knew that's not the case. And a few years after that, I was involved in writing up a chapter based on that particular data in a 2-volume book edited by someone known as Orton Smith, an American. And again, the co-authors of the chapter were arguing of how terrible the data showed in terms of giving. But we knew every time, probably our governments throughout the African continent do not have as much capacity to deliver social welfare, for instance, but people survive against huge odds. And that particular survival is not because they have a lot of material resources, it's because they are willing to share whatever little that they have. How do you define that if it's not generosity that CAF is talking about? So in a sense, that would be my point of departure. But getting back to the question of what Barry Zamot is asking about, I think what's happening here is conversations like this, but also we're having this conversation because we were able to go to the field, talk to people who give from all tiers of society. The high-net worth individuals to the ordinary man and woman in the streets or in the village who help each other in a mutual reciprocity type of thing. And when we have this, and I know there's a foundation in Kenya, Kenya Community Foundation, that has been trying to grapple with these things, is to try and see how then can we get this generalized giving into some form of structure that can have better impact, if you will, or can be able to address all the structural barriers and all these other elements that we are trying to fight, so that this can become sustainable, can have even better results. I think the journal is definitely headed in that particular direction with these particular conversations, but the type of research that you're doing and the type of conversations that we're having. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Barbara says, I'm sending my sincere congratulations to all on the launch of this unique and important journal. Additionally, to laud you for including all of Africa in your scope, including North Africa. From where I sit in Cairo, this is a significant decision. In that light, how do you plan to deal with the language differences across the continent? It's not directed at anyone in particular, and I wonder whether the editorial guys want to address this one. Who wants to take that one? Prof?
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that comment. So at the moment, we're starting with English as the primary medium of communication, just because it's the language of academia and etc. But as the project grows, we have other African languages, Swahili notably. We have here in Southern Africa a lot of languages that we can interpret. So it's a very important question that the questioner asked. Also Arabic, and I remember we had a discussion of which language to adopt. So I think at this stage, we haven't defined ourselves as a single language group, as a center and also as a continent. So as we develop this idea forward, we will be having translation services, and people from French-speaking countries, Arabic-speaking countries can also write, and we will be able to interpret. We have models where both languages or more than 2 languages are presented. But you will understand that this is our very maiden edition, and we will consider this as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And another comment from Richard. How does CAPSI function in times of a pandemic, especially during this time of a great pandemic, COVID-19? How do you get donations for functionality? Anyone?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. And I just need to make sure that I understand it fully. If you're asking how CAPSI is functioning organizationally, obviously we have been hit very hard by the pandemic. Our office has been closed pretty much since the 27th of March. Our colleagues have had to adapt to working from home. The vast majority of the team had never worked from home before. We obviously also continue to contribute in our role as a member of the CAP Global Alliance, which means that historically as a group of CEOs, we would meet once or twice a year in London to look at our strategy and our policy going forward. We've not been able to do that. Our strategy and policy meetings have been virtual. We have also now, we ourselves have had to become agile and you know, embrace flexibility and that kind of things. We've had to learn to work very differently with our clients, both our non-profit and corporate clients. Funding for us has likewise been a challenge. We are a non-profit organization ourselves, but we have to say we have been most fortunate that we have been able to be operational and continue with our important work during this difficult time. I just need to clarify if that answers the question or not.
Yeah, I think it does. Really, I think it does, yes. William Matarinika, I observed during Cyclone Idai that data collection systems were controlled by international NGOs. How best can African governments be assisted to control data collection in philanthropy and hence assist in crafting Africa's own narratives? Again, not directed at anyone in particular, but if this is a theme that you are passionate about, any one of you can please address it. Thanks so much for the brilliant comment and question, William. Okay, who's going to go next?
Okay, so thank you. So one of the capacities we are aiming to build is to create a data center, and we've already done that with some of the studies that are being commissioned. Currently, there's a study when Becky gave the annual report. We're looking at 30 countries with the highest GDP, and we're studying various forms of philanthropy there. We will collect that data and house it within the center. I think we have big projects that will also begin to actually interrogate even the data collection process itself. My traditional specialty has always been in applied econometrics, and one of the frustrations we face is the quality of the data that we use on Africa, especially how it is collected and how it is treated. And so most of our indicators currently, as the questioner rightly put it, are not even driven by us. So when we are talking about GDP and consumer prices and etc., it is somebody else's methodology that we are talking about. For instance, consumer prices are normally collected around the largest cities. And we know that most of our people don't live in the largest cities. So a lot of the data that we talk about from the indicators that we use in studying philanthropy currently are unrepresentative of the continent. But the hard, honest truth is that this is all that we have at the moment. And CAPSI as a center has projects that will go into having our own data hubs. But this is something for the future, but definitely on the cards for us to do.
And while I still have you here, Prof, anyone want to come in? Who did I miss there?
Yes, I wanted to come in just on what the response that Prof had given, but also give a response from the value of citizen-driven data collection. And we have actually seen this value in just the responses to COVID. And a number of organizations, the Southern Africa Trust being one of them, have got data portals that are collecting information and data on community-driven responses. The question there is, like, if you go onto the Southern Africa Trust website, you'll find we've got a knowledge hub that is housing data which is provided by the community foundations that I spoke about, the NGOs, the different economic actors in the region. And we have that as a clearinghouse and as a data portal. The question, though, is, for us, is to think through how we drive traffic to that kind of data and how we get people to understand the credibility of that data and not rely purely on data that is provided by the state. Information and data sits in different places. And if we understand that the communities that are affected themselves can tell stories, can provide data on what the impact is, what their needs are, the trends that they're seeing from their localities, and that data becomes relevant for some of the global and continental questions that we have, then we can begin to look at sources of data from different spaces. And there's a lot of citizen-driven data that NGOs, civil society organizations, and community foundations are churning out.
Okay, thank you so much, Masego. This is always the toughest moment for me as a moderator because the great questions are coming in, people are engaging with this topic, but unfortunately we have run out of time and we want to wrap this up in time. But it is encouraging for you. It means that we need to come and do round 2 of this conversation. Some amazing, amazing comments. And I think that I do want to end it on a positive note. I know, Akwasi, that you had a question underneath your comment, but we won't have time for it, but I'll just take your generous comment. It says, this is such a great development in the entire field of philanthropy. Thank you so much, CAPSI. As the great African proverb goes, until the lions have their own historians, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And it says, I feel so honored to be associated with CAPSI and to know some of the leading thought leaders. Akwasi, thank you so much. I unfortunately cannot ask your question. Okay, so, you know, this is not a job for me, sitting and moderating. I walk away with so much information, such an awakening and consciousness and lessons that I never, ever thought I would learn. So thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, your insights, and your passions. Thank you for making this a very successful launch. I want to congratulate every single one of you on the publication of the International Review of Philanthropy and Social Investment Journal. Thank you for your contribution and for broadening our understanding. Everybody who was a part of this, the organizers, the different speakers, Wits University, and the different collaborators. Thank you so very much. It always feels rushed because there was so much content to go through. Thanks indeed for asking me to be your moderator. Tsitsi Masiyiwa, Professor Alagidede, Dr. Bhekinkosi Moyo, Gill, Dr. Jacob Mati, Masego, Madzwamuse. Thank you so very much, and all of you watching.
Thank you.